So it's a great pleasure to welcome our first speaker for today in our theme, which is Neuroscience and Human Identity. Our speaker is Dr. Sharon Dirckx, who is a senior tutor at the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. She has a PhD in brain imaging from the University of Cambridge and has held research positions in Oxford and the Medical Center of Wisconsin in the United States. I'm sure she'll be telling us about her most recent book, which came out last year, entitled Am I Just My Brain?, which examines questions of human identity from the perspectives of neuroscience, philosophy, and theology. So without further ado, Sharon, it's a great pleasure to welcome you this morning, and I'm going to hand straight over to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Hugh. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and let me extend my welcome to you wherever in the world you are watching this morning. And I'm looking forward to speaking to you about the subject of neuroscience and identity. Thanks so much, Hugh, for the warm welcome. And as Hugh mentioned, some of the things that I talk about today and more can be found in a book that I recently published called Am I Just My Brain?, which looks at precisely this theme of neuroscience and human identity. And so we want to look at the question this morning, what is a human being? What exactly are we? Are we merely advanced primates? Are we machines? Are we souls temporarily housed in a body? Are we just physical beings, or is there more to humanity? And of course, this is a question that has occupied people at every stage of human history. I wonder if today you were asked what it is that makes you, you, what you would say. And if we were to ask people, we might find answers lie in a range of different areas. Some people might say the thing that makes them them is their relationships, community, family. Some people might say it's the experiences they've had, good and bad. They shape us, they form us. Some people might say the thing that really makes me me is career and purpose and influence in the world. And then others might say, really, the thing that makes me me is purely physical. It is material. And I want to look at this line of thought today, that the line of thought that says the central thing that makes you, you, is your brain. Now, of course, the brain is clearly playing a key role and a very central and integral role in what it means to be a human being. But this view is more strongly put than that. It's saying your brain defines you. If you like, you are your brain. The choices that you make for good or bad, the personality that you have, the behaviors that you exhibit, even the religious beliefs that you may or may not have, are all dictated by the activity in your brain. Now, I'm sure I don't need to convince an audience such as this of how incredible the human brain is. I spent over 10 years in functional MRI research, investigating, studying it in all of its beauty. The human brain is more developed in humans than in any other creature. It contains somewhere between 80 and 100 billion cells. At any moment is sending thousands of impulses at speeds of over 250 miles an hour. At any one moment, you are generating enough electricity in your head to power an LED light. This incredible organ sitting in our heads is a 1.5 kilo melting pot of chemicals, hormones, and electrical activity. And despite only taking up 2% of the body's weight, it uses 20% of its energy, which is why when you're studying really hard and working towards exams or something that takes up a lot of brain space, you're actually burning a lot of calories. But just because the brain is an incredible thing, does it necessarily follow that everything that it means to be a human being can be explained in terms of brain chemistry and electrical activity? That's quite a different thing to be saying. After all, some brilliant scientists believe this. Francis Crick, who is well known for co-discovering the DNA double helix, winning the joint Nobel Prize for it with James Watson, said this in his later book, The Astonishing Hypothesis. He said that you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. As Lewis Carroll might have phrased it, you're nothing but a pack of neurons. What do you think about this view? Is it true that we are simply packs of neurons? Is this the best story that can be told about human identity? And the you are your brain view or story has also filtered into popular culture and is being expressed by non-scientists such as historian Yuval Harari. Now, Harari is the author of 2 best-selling books. Among others, he has written Sapiens, which looks at the history of humankind, and Homo Deus, which looks at the future of humanity. Together, these books have sold millions of copies worldwide. And in Homo Deus, Harari asserts that over the last few decades, biologists have reached the firm conclusion that the man pressing the buttons and drinking the tea from a vending machine, that's the context of the quote, is also an algorithm. Humans are algorithms. In other words, humans are machines. Well, you might be asking, so what? What does it matter if we believe that? What difference does it make to the world? Well, if it is true that we are purely, entirely physical beings driven by the activity of our brains, the implications are significant. Firstly, there are very big implications for human freedom. Are we really genuinely free and able to make meaningful decisions, or do we just do what our brains tell us? But if that is the case, then why is it that humans strive for autonomy and strive for their rights in this world? There are also huge implications for moral responsibility and judicial decisions. If people are not the true person performing the act, good or bad, can they be held morally responsible? Secondly, there are implications for religious belief and experience. Are these simply generated by the brain? Do they begin and end there and therefore don't point to anything bigger beyond? There are implications for that. Thirdly, there are ethical implications. What is the value of a human life, and is personhood dependent on having a fully functioning, healthy brain? And if so, what value do we assign to those whose brains are not fully developed, such as the unborn or premature babies, or those with brain damage or with degenerative diseases such as dementia and Alzheimer's? So there are significant implications for ethical decisions and how we treat people both at the beginning and end of life and those with severe disability. And finally, there are implications for AI, artificial intelligence. If human consciousness is entirely a physical thing and can be explained in terms of brain activity, then will there one day be conscious robots walking the streets of your city and mine? And so the view that you take on the nature of human beings today impacts what we believe will be possible through AI in the future. This may not be an entirely unattractive option for some of us. If humans are just algorithms, then we're all upgradable with a new improved inorganic version of ourselves, which for some may be not such a terrible idea. So the answer to the question, what is it that makes you, has far-reaching implications. This is not just a question and a problem for neuroscientists, nor just for philosophers or theologians, but it actually affects everybody. But is there a better story that can be told about human identity? Well, many would agree that it's not enough to simply talk about the brain. We also need to consider the mind. You see, there are two different things at play. There is the brain with all of its neurons and electrical activity and synapses and chemicals and hormones. But then there is also the mind with all of its thoughts and feelings and emotions, memories and decisions. And so in addition to having a brain, each of us also has an inner world, an inner reality. We have each a unique first-person perspective on the world. And as Thomas Nagel put it, formerly of Princeton, now New York University, in his very famous paper of 1974, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? He says there is something that it is like to be you, that no one else can really access in quite the same way. We are conscious beings. But what exactly is the nature of human consciousness? Well, that's a huge question. We can only scrape the surface of it today, but essentially at one end, you have the you are your brain view, which says consciousness is entirely physical or is physically based. And many in that end of the spectrum will be looking for neural correlates of human consciousness. And then at the other end of the spectrum are those which say consciousness is non-physical, it is immaterial. And therefore, for that reason, consciousness itself lies beyond the scope of science. You might be able to find out what's happening in the brain while there are different states of consciousness going on, but consciousness itself lies beyond the scope of the scientific method. And of course, those that take the physical view would also argue that human levels of consciousness will one day be possible in machines and algorithms. The Turing Test was a test developed by Alan Turing in the 1950s to measure the level of intelligence of an algorithm, where an algorithm and a human were both anonymously asked a series of questions. And if the questions of the algorithm are indistinguishable from those of the human, then the algorithm was said to have passed the test, to pass the Turing test, and is considered intelligent. And there are all kinds of examples of this on the internet and in the news. And perhaps you might remember one example of the supposed Ukrainian 13-year-old boy, Eugene Guzman, that fooled a third of its interrogators into believing it was human in 2014. And so some would say, yes, it is possible to achieve an intelligence which is indistinguishable from humans. But many have raised the very important question, even if a machine appears to be conscious, does this mean that they are conscious? A few years ago, my children attempted a conversation with Siri, which is one of the ways that AI comes into our homes, isn't it? Siri, how are you? I'm fine, thanks for asking. Siri, how are you feeling today? I'm happy to be alive. Siri, are you a person? Sorry, Sharon, I've been advised not to discuss my existential status. Siri, why are we here? I don't know, maybe the Genius Bar folks can answer that. Siri, why do you exist? I process, therefore I am. This is perhaps an overly simplistic example, but our interactions with some forms of AI can give the impression that there are conscious persons behind these technologies. But it was John Searle that raised this important question, that an ability to output responses in a human-like way does not speak to the question of human consciousness. And he illustrated this using his Chinese room thought experiment in 1980. And Searle asked us to imagine this scenario where you have a person outside of a closed room passing Chinese messages to another person inside a closed room. Now, the person inside the room has no knowledge of the Chinese language, but they have a book to interpret the message coming in and output a response. And so they do that. And so to the person outside, it seems that the person inside speaks Chinese, but that's actually incorrect. All they can do is process Chinese characters. And John Searle makes the point that the ability to process information, however efficiently, is a very different thing from talking about an algorithm having human levels of consciousness. Now, of course, AI has greatly advanced in recent decades, benefiting many areas of life, including finance, healthcare, transportation, education, agriculture, and so on. But it is a very different thing to speak of algorithms possessing human consciousness. And those working in the field make a distinction between weak AI that focuses on a particular, very focused pre-programmed task, which is what a lot of our current AI is doing, versus strong AI, where algorithms will begin to outperform and be superior to human beings, and also be able to learn and adapt along the way. And again, those two things are, well, they're both possible, but for an algorithm to actually possess human levels of consciousness is still another layer in addition to that, which is very far from where we are currently. And that is because humans have an inner world, a conscious mind that needs some explaining. And so a key question to be asking is, what is the relationship between the brain and the mind? And really, this is where the heart of the conversation lies. This has been debated for centuries, since the ancient world, and is known as the mind-brain problem. How do you get from brain chemistry to that conversation went badly today? How do you get from electrical activity to what shall we eat for dinner, or I must remember our anniversary? And the perspective driving some of this discussion is essentially saying that mind and brain are the same thing. Mental states are brain states. Mental processes are brain processes. And this, I mean, there are lots of different terms out there, but this can be summarized as the view reductive physicalism, where the mind is actually reducible to physical processes in the brain. And this is another way of saying that there isn't really anything it is like to be you. There is only brain activity. But surely this is an absurd way of thinking about human beings. On one level, it's incoherent. It's saying that my first-person perspective is that there is no first-person perspective. And secondly, we don't live as though that is the case. Our bookshops are full of autobiographies expressing people's experiences in life, and we read them and digest them, assuming their truthfulness. Now we all know too well of the story that we have to tell about how COVID-19 has impacted us and our families and our neighborhoods. And we live as though our human experience is genuine and not merely brain chemicals. Mindfulness experts tell us to focus in on this inner self for a better state of well-being. And moreover, we treat others as though they are conscious beings too. We experience outrage and anger at things like human trafficking, humanitarian crises, and institutional racism, precisely because we believe the people involved are not simply packs of neurons, but conscious beings who experience suffering and injustice. And moreover, we actually do not need to step beyond neuroscience itself to see that the situation is way more complex than simply chalking it all down to cell voltages and neurotransmitters. You see, there are many examples in the literature showing that the mind itself is powerful in its effect on the brain. And one such study is a study which looked at London taxi drivers done at UCL. It was a brain imaging study by Eleanor Maguire in 2006. And in this study, London taxi drivers, as you may know, have to memorize the layout of London so they can drive someone in a taxi anywhere that they ask from memory. And so this requires a huge amount of memorization of roads and names and layouts. And what they did in this study was that they imaged the brains of taxi drivers while they were doing their training, and they compared them with bus drivers who don't need to memorize this layout of London, which is called the knowledge. And what they saw was a significant difference in the size of the hippocampus, a brain region known to be involved in memory, a significant increase in size of hippocampus compared with people who weren't learning the knowledge. In other words, what they were seeing was there are higher processes involving memory and spatial memory exerting a top-down effect on the underlying brain mechanisms, suggesting that there is much more going on than simply neurons driving everything. The mind is also, higher cognitive processes are also able to have a top-down effect on the physical brain. And this is a phenomenon referred to as downward causation. Another classic example of downward causation is in the placebo effect. This is a well-characterized phenomenon in medicine, that if someone is given a blank drug that they believe will help them, it will have some therapeutic benefit. This is another example of the mind being powerful in its ability to impact the brain and body. So we don't even need to step beyond the neuroscience and medicine to see that it's not as straightforward as simply saying that your brain drives everything. Clearly, what the science is showing us is that mind and brain are connected. If you put someone in an MRI scanner and give them a task that uses their working memory, then you see the areas and networks connected with working memory lighting up and being activated. Clearly, mind and brain are connected. But sometimes we make the error of assuming that just because mind and brain are connected, that they are therefore identical. And this is not necessarily the case. Let me try and show you a little bit more why this is more complex. Perhaps you've had one of these this morning. Maybe it's not morning where some of you are, but it is here anyway. Imagine I were to ask you to describe to me the smell of coffee. What would you say? You know, you might describe to me the chemical structure of caffeine. If you have to describe it to me in physical terms, you might describe the chemical structure of caffeine, but that wouldn't get us any closer to the smell of coffee. Or you might describe the physiology happening as this coffee goes into my body and is digested, but that doesn't get me any closer to the smell of coffee. If you want to understand what the smell of coffee is like, you need to smell it. And a physical description is not going to get you any closer to this. Now, the smell of coffee is an example of a quale, or plural qualia, which is a term that philosophers use to describe qualitative experiences that are impossible to describe physically. Other examples include the color red, or the taste of watermelon, or seeing a scene of incredible beauty. And so many scientists and philosophers believe that brain processes alone are not enough to explain qualia. Imagine we wanted to do an experiment to find out what it's like for you to revise for an exam or write a report, go through an audit at work, and we want to capture as much brain data as we can. So we put an EEG cap on you. We capture 24-hour EEG. We might put you in an MRI scanner, take some structural scans and some functional scans, maybe some diffusion tensor imaging as well. Would that get us the information that we need? Would that tell us what it is like for you to revise for your next exam or go through an audit at work? Well, it would give us some very interesting and helpful information, but it wouldn't tell us what it is actually like for you to go through that. For that, we need to ask you, we need to talk to you. You see, it's not enough to get inside the brain. We need to also access the person, the experience of the person, and for that we need to speak to you. You see, you don't need to dig very far to see that brain processes and human experience are two very different things, and how you get from one to the other has occupied philosophers and scientists for centuries, to the extent that many atheists and agnostics today still recognize and acknowledge that this is a hard problem to solve. And some have, well, David Chalmers, previously of Australian National University, now of New York University, professor of philosophy, has named this the hard problem of consciousness. Easy problems involve looking at which parts of the brain are turned on and off when you might move from one state of consciousness to another, for example, from a state of being awake to being asleep, or from being conscious to being under an anesthetic. You might look at the brain areas that are switched on and off in those processes. Now, these are not easy by any means, and whole lifetimes of research are taken up in their quest, but compared to the hard problem, they are trivial. The hard problem is attempting to answer the question, how do we account for what something is like? How do we make sense of conscious experience? Or as Baroness Susan Greenfield, professor of physiology at Oxford, put it in a lecture in 2012, how does the water of boring old brain cells and sludgy stuff translate into the wine of phenomenological subjective experience? How do you get from water to wine? And many argue that chemical reactions and cell voltages alone are not enough to make this leap. You see, the story being told by some about human identity is not enough to account for the complexity of human consciousness. This view that you are your brain offers a diminished view of the human person, wanting to see a person just through this one lens. And in reality, algorithms don't think, brains don't think, people think using their brains. And so what are the better stories that can be told? Are there any better stories that can be told about the human person, about human identity? Well, there are many alternative ways of describing this mind-brain relationship that might make more sense of the scientific method. It also might make more sense of what we observe clinically, what we observe relationally as well, and it might make sense philosophically. There are many views out there, but I offer you a summary of two of those views, and these are views that many agnostics and atheists that also acknowledge the limitations of a reductive approach would subscribe to. So one view is that the mind emerges from the brain. This view says that the brain generates the mind when a number of parts come together and gradually grow in complexity. Something new comes into being that is greater than the sum of its parts, but that is connected and very much tied to those original building blocks. So this view is sometimes referred to as non-reductive physicalism, which says that the mind and consciousness are emergent properties of the physical brain, but are not reducible simply to physics and chemistry. And this is a view held by theists and non-theists alike in the fields. But questions that people that hold this view have to answer include, well, how exactly does the brain generate the mind? How exactly does the mind emerge from a physical system? Are we not still coming up against this hard problem of consciousness? You still have to explain how you get experience from a physical system. And so people that hold this view have different ways of answering that question. Another view is to say that the mind is beyond the brain. And this view says that actually there are two kinds of distinct substance. The mind is a non-physical substance and the brain is a physical substance. And these two are distinct and can exist independently of each other, but they do interact. And it's referred to as substance dualism, two substances. It's traceable to the ancient world and has been voiced by the 17th century mathematician and philosopher Revd Descartes. And I guess questions that people that hold this view need to ask and answer and respond to are, how can exactly a non-physical mind interact with a physical brain? How do we make sense of the sciences in light of such a position, which says that mind and brain are clearly connected, they're not two separate things? And so there are different views out there that people have offered to try and make better sense of the human person and the world in which we live. Whatever view is held, either way, the data coming from clinical research is certainly suggesting that human consciousness and its relationship to the human brain is more complex than simply brain chemistry, than more complex than simply a purely physical description. And I can only show you a couple of examples in this talk, but one example which originates from the University of Cambridge was just over 10 years ago, a groundbreaking brain imaging study conducted by Adrian Owen and his team that was studying patients in a persistent vegetative state to see if there were signs of consciousness. Now, the normal way to test for consciousness is to see if someone can follow a command, but when someone is in a persistent vegetative state, they're not able to speak or move. And what they essentially were able to do is to ask them respond using mental tasks. And they were able to establish communication and train some patients to do two things. Firstly, imagine you're playing tennis. We perhaps all imagine we're playing tennis right now, with wishing that Wimbledon was happening. When you imagine that you're playing tennis, what happens is that the areas to do with motor function and control light up in your brain. And the second thing they ask them to do is imagine they're moving around their house at home. And what happens there is a series of networks to do with spatial navigation are engaged in the brain. And then they went on to ask a very small number of patients in a persistent vegetative state a series of biographical questions that could be verified by family members. And they asked, if you want to answer yes to this question, imagine you're playing tennis. And if you want to answer no, imagine you're moving around your house at home. And in a very small number of patients, they were able to answer each question correctly, showing that they were conscious to some extent, despite having significant damage to their brain and showing no outward signs of awareness. Now, these kinds of discoveries are sobering. A number of studies have obviously been done since then as well. But if you are your brain, then we probably wouldn't, if it can all be simply chalked down to kind of brain chemistry, then this kind of data is puzzling. And it suggests that human beings are more complex. And as Owen himself put it in his popular level book, Into the Grey Zone, he said that what we're seeing here is intact minds adrift deep within damaged bodies and brains. Human consciousness and its interaction with the brain is complex. And again, we don't need to leave neuroscience to even make this case. We could also look to near-death experiences. Since the advent of neurosurgery and cardiac surgery, we're starting to hear reports from patients upon resuscitation of talking about being conscious. Now, there are all kinds of kind of interesting and slightly wacky things out there on the internet. Some of it could be questionable, some of it could be fabrication, but there have also been a number of systematic studies conducted by cardiologists in the Netherlands, in the UK, in the US, studying thousands of patients and reporting between 6 and 10% of patients talking about some level of consciousness during the procedure, even when in some cases it required being in a state of clinical death. So there are, the brain is cooled, the heart is stopped, and so they're in a state of clinical death. And so what do we make of this kind of data? Obviously we need, it's still emerging, still being consolidated, but is this another pointer that human beings are very complex beings? Some may say it's simply brain residual or undetectable brain activity, which of course is not impossible, but it's still an interesting data set, and especially when a previously physicalist neurosurgeon experiences one himself. You may have come across the story of Eben Alexander, a neurosurgeon with a 20-year career in academic neurosurgery, operated on countless patients, and very much heard some of his patients tell him that they had experiences which he discounted. If you don't have a working brain, you can't be conscious, was his view at that time, until 2008, at the age of 54, he experienced a severe case of bacterial meningitis. He was in a coma for 7 days. His entire neocortex had shut down. The parts of your brain responsible for all of your higher functioning were not working at all. He was not expected to survive, but somehow went on to make a full recovery. And he tells his story in his New York Times bestseller, Proof of Heaven, where he talks about when being in this coma, experiencing a very clear and vivid reality, including meeting a sister he never knew he had, but later discovered had died before he had a chance to meet her. And so he had a very dramatic change of position. He puts it like this: mine was in some ways a perfect storm of near-death experiences. As a practicing neurosurgeon with decades of research and hands-on work in the operating room behind me, I was in a better than average position to judge not only the reality, but also the implications of what happened to me. Those implications are tremendous beyond description. My experience showed me that the death of the body and the brain are not the end of consciousness, that human experience continues beyond the grave. And you might say, well, this is one person's view, but even one instance ought to give us pause for thought. And when we're kind of constructing a theory of consciousness and a philosophy of it and a science of it, we need a framework that's going to help us take full account of the full range of stories that are being told about humanity and what it means to be a human being. Something that takes account of the full scope of clinical observation is what will be needed to fully understand human consciousness. And of course, on the basis of a lifetime of clinical research, some have drawn very interesting conclusions. One example is Michael Agne, professor of neurosurgery at Stony Brook in New York, who makes the point that many of his patients are missing large chunks of their brains and yet have very good minds. And after 30 years of working in the field, he has concluded that the mind of a person is beyond simply the workings of their brain. And he comments in this way. He says, materialism, the view that matter is all that exists, is the premise of much contemporary thinking about what a human being is. And yet evidence from the laboratory, the operating room, and clinical experience points to a less fashionable conclusion. Human beings straddle the material and immaterial realms. Well, as we close, I'd like to just sort of close in the last couple of minutes by actually asking a slightly different question. Because even if all of our questions about the scientific workings of the mind and its relation to the brain are answered, even if we do understand the neural correlates of human consciousness, and I very much hope that one day we will, that will still leave some questions unanswered. Why do we have a mind in the first place? Why are we conscious beings? And as David Chalmers is recorded to have said, there is a difference between finding a correlate and finding an explanation. Why are we conscious in the first place? And does a purely physicalist approach offer the best explanation for human consciousness? Well, many argue not. that the forces of nature alone are not enough to explain the human mind, and therefore we need to look to other possibilities. And really it comes down to this question: is what we see with our eyes all that there is in this world? Is the material world all that there is? And if we entertain the possibility that God exists, does that help us make sense of the human mind, of human consciousness? Well, a number of key philosophers and scientists argue yes, it does, because if God exists, then mind is fundamental to the universe and preceded everything else. The first sentence of the Bible says that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And if this is true, then we have grounds for making sense of the human mind. And there is hope for solving the hard problem of consciousness, because we didn't start with physical things, we started with mind, the mind of God. And this view also says that humans are made in the image of God and reflect some of his qualities, where I guess were made with God's imprints. In other words, as a big picture perspective on this, we have a mind because God has a mind. We think because God thinks. We are conscious beings because God is a conscious, rational being. And so we've looked this morning about whether it is possible to tell a better story than some offer today about human identity. Well, if it is true that humans are made in the image of God, then there is an identity to human beings that runs so much deeper than the activity of our brains. It means that we are way more than chemicals and machines. Human beings are sacred and of immeasurable value and worth, each created for a life of meaning and purpose, regardless of what happens to their body and brain. And if that is true, then there is hope for us all. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you, Sharon, very much for a very illuminating talk. And I'm going to now look at some questions that have been coming in while you've been speaking. And we have a bit of time, about 20 minutes or so, in which to look at some of these. So the first question I'd like to address takes us right back to the beginning of your talk, where you spoke about what it means to be human. And the questioner asks, is it right just to think that there might be a single answer, or does this depend on context? But anyway, is what you're trying to do to say that whatever the answer to that first part of the question, the physicalist approach is an inadequate one?
Yes, I think the purpose of thank you for the question. The purpose, I guess, of my talk was primarily to speak to what does it mean to be a person in the light of neuroscience, and particularly the view that seeks to anchor human identity in neuroscience, in purely the activity of the brain. And so the purpose of the talk is to expand that. Obviously, there are all kinds of answers that we could give to the question, what is a human being? As you say, depending on context. But I think that as you kind of go through the layers, there are sort of certain perspectives that kind of sit above all of the other ones. And so I think that I was trying to respond to it on the level of neuroscience, but there are certain sort of really big picture questions. What does it mean to be me? That were really helpful to think about and address. And if we are made in the image of God, then that's a kind of a perspective that kind of transcends the other kinds of helpful perspective on the question as well.
Okay, thank you. When you were talking about consciousness, one of our viewers raises the question, when we start out life as a baby, we have a very limited awareness of the world around us. what's actually going on? Are we learning just by developing an increased awareness, or actually are we developing our consciousness? Can you say a little bit about how consciousness and the brain
Yes.
connect with child
Yes.
development?
Thank you. Yes, thank you for the question. I would say that there is a difference between awareness of the external world and I guess consciousness in the way that I was meaning in this talk, where you have that reflexive self-awareness. And this might be a distinction that some might say exists between humans and the animal kingdom as well. That, there's a difference between responding to external stimuli in your environment and having that reflexive self-awareness of oneself. Now, in the kind of case of a fetus developing in utero, clearly what we see is that the level of consciousness is proportional to what's happening in the brain, and as the brain grows and develops, consciousness grows and develops, and we see that in kind of studies of infants as they grow in their awareness of the world, I guess. And so the level of consciousness will be sort of proportional to how developed they are. And this is another example of how consciousness and brain are clearly connected. But there are observations that are made that, that babies can hear from the womb beyond a certain stage. This is a complex thing. I'm not sure I'm necessarily the kind of an expert in this area to speak to it, but they're certainly aware of their environment. Who knows whether they are aware of self? I'm not aware of the studies that cover that or address that.
Okay, well look, here's another tricky one that just touches on something that you just raised in your answer, and that is, in the animal world, have there been studies, are you aware of studies where people have looked at a similar brain-mind dichotomy? Is there any evidence? Has anybody looked for evidence?
Well, thank you for the question. If you didn't hear Simon Conway Morris's lecture yesterday, and I believe Kara's yesterday as well, I definitely recommend listening to those, because they outline some of the animal work that has been done. The limitation of doing a mind-brain kind of study in the animal kingdom is that there is a limited accessibility of language. The reason we can access someone's mind as a human being is because we can ask them, and that person understands the information being asked of them and is able to give a response. This seems to be something that is utterly unique to human beings, which limits the kinds of studies that can be done in other species.
Okay, now look, here's a question. There's actually a couple of questions on a similar theme. One word that you've not used in your talk, but religious people use all the time, is the word soul. Would you like to comment a little bit on what you think religious people mean by the word soul and how it fits into your mind-body mind-consciousness distinction?
Yes, absolutely. Well, I mean, it's a huge area. It's a huge topic. And it really depends who you ask. And actually, of the kind of different positions that I have voiced here, the two alternative views, you might find Christians subscribing to one or other or neither of those views. Some might say that the soul is actually an emergent property of the brain that grows and develops as we develop, but others would say that the soul is a non-physical part, and actually mind and consciousness reside there, not in anything physical, although they do interact with the physical. But if we look at scripture, and often when we think of the soul, we might think of Plato's very famous for his views on this soul being this immaterial and immortal part of a person that eventually floats off at death. But actually that's not consistent with a Hebrew notion of soul. So when soul is mentioned in the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament, it's actually not referring to the term that we mean it philosophically when we're discussing this subject, is actually more referring to the whole person. It's a very holistic term. So, for example, the psalmist might say, "Praise the Lord, my soul, all my inmost being, praise his holy name." That's not referring to some immaterial part of him that will float away. That's saying that's an expression of extent, that I'm worshipping you with everything that I've got. And that does seem to be very much when the terms nephesh, which is the Hebrew for soul, and suke in the New Testament, they're actually expressing a holistic term. However, there are also indications of dualism in scripture, particularly in Paul's letters in the New Testament. In Corinthians, he talks about a possible out-of-body experience, about being caught up to the third heaven, whether he was in the body or out of the body, he doesn't know, but God knows. And so we see actually both holism and we see dualistic suggestions in scripture, and so it's really a complex situation. But I think the view of the human person for the Christian is that we are integrated physical and spiritual beings, both in this life and in the life to come. Heaven is not a place that you float off to into some ghostly, floaty experience. Our faith anchors around Jesus, who was bodily raised from the dead, and he is the first of what will be true for anyone that follows him, meaning that new heaven and new earth is physical and bodily. It's embodied and it's physical and spiritual. And so that's very much the kind of Judeo-Christian framework.
Thank you very much. Now, often when we talk about topics like this, particularly areas of science that we don't fully understand, Christians can have a tendency to say, and therefore that means there's something else, there's a God. It's what people have colloquially known the God of the gaps idea, that if you can't explain something, then God did it. Do you think it's fair to level that at some of the things you've been saying this morning?
Oh, thank you for the question. I can see why it's easy to necessarily think that I might be trying to do that, but I'm actually all for neural correlates of human consciousness being discovered and the underlying brain mechanisms being discovered. But actually, it was the agnostic David Chalmers that I quoted when he said there's a difference between finding a correlate and finding an explanation. You see, even if all of our scientific questions are answered, and it's very much, I'm a scientist myself, or a former scientist myself, and I very much want to see that be the case, but that will still leave questions unanswered, such as why does consciousness exist? The scientific method can't answer that kind of question. In order to answer that, we need to step beyond science into areas of philosophy and theology and thinking about humanity more broadly. And so we're not talking about a God of the gaps here. We're saying, look, if God exists, does that help us answer those kinds of questions? Why consciousness exists? Now, this is a problem that, despite throwing the brightest minds at it for many centuries, no persuasive answers have been given. But if God exists, then we have a basis for making sense of it, because our universe is preceded by a conscious being. And that's not to kind of undermine or denigrate any of the science at all. In fact, that can flourish alongside that. And here we have then two parallel kind of accounts of the world that together make better sense of the human being.
Okay, thank you. Let me ask you a question now, which takes you almost back to some of the fundamentals of your talk. Perhaps we should have asked this at the beginning. But just can you clarify for us what you mean by person and what you mean by consciousness? This is a question that one of our viewers is asking. Okay.
Can you give me the context, just a bit more about the context of person in which...
I'll read you the question. I know I may be asking you an unanswerable question, but how would you define a person and consciousness? We often use these terms, but has there been a consensus and understanding of them?
So, I mean, again, I think how you define a person depends on who you ask and what their kind of worldview is, and so, I mean, a person, as I meant it, is how do we make sense of the fact that we seem to be, yes, embodied, we are physical beings, but we're also relational, we're also, well, we might have a spiritual side to us, and we also have a mental side to us as well. And so how do we take account of all of those different dimensions in a person? So that's how I would sort of define that, sort of an integrated, relational, spiritual, physical being. Consciousness, again, it depends who you ask. Some say that they take a very general term and just refer to it as experience, and some say no, it's that reflexive, internal, being able to reflect and on oneself. And some kind of integrate the two and say that it's sort of both of these things, but these are very slippery terms that just are used in all kinds of different ways in the literature.
Well, yeah, thank you for those clarifications. I'm going to come to our last question now, which may require a slightly longer answer from you, but as a thread woven through everything that you've said to us, both in your talk and in your answers to the questions, is evidence that you yourself have an active Christian faith. How have you found this, particularly during your scientific career? How have you found that impacting on your science, and how has your science impacted on your Christian beliefs?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So a key component for me as part of my story is that I knew I was a scientist from a very, very early age, and knew that I wanted to do a PhD in something, but didn't believe in God, and was reading kind of things like Richard Dawkins, The Selfish Gene, and all of that, different kinds of things. And then I arrived at university and had assimilated somehow the view that science and belief in God were incompatible. I don't know if anyone had directly said it to me, but somehow I'd assimilated it from things I'd read, things I'd listened to, and views that were expressed around me. And I actually began to kind of ask questions myself about that. I asked that question even at an event where there were a panel of Christians. You could ask questions, and I was actually told, well, no, they're not incompatible. That's a bit like asking someone to choose between Mark Zuckerberg and the programming languages underlying Facebook as the reason that Facebook exists. Obviously, those are two parallel explanations that work together. That set me on a journey of asking more questions. And actually, I sort of really dug in and asked the very hard questions about, why there is suffering in the world, and why, if God exists, he would allow that. And so I reached the conclusion that it made more sense that God existed than he didn't. And obviously I could say a lot more about that here. What that was interesting in regard to my studies, I was studying biochemistry, and obviously, loved all the kind of evolutionary theory that we were, digging into at a molecular level, and came to the conclusion again that I didn't need to choose between these two things either, that both were compatible: belief in God and thinking about the theory, the way in which biological life came about. So for me, it was very much that it made more sense as a scientist with God that God actually existed, and that as a being, he isn't anti-intellectual. He doesn't ask us to stop thinking in order to believe in him. In fact, he is very much the one that gives us the capacity to think in the first place. And so I took that with me then into a PhD, into neuroimaging, and into a postdoc. And it didn't kind of diminish my science in any way. It actually, in some ways, augmented it. There were a number of occasions where God sort of very directly helped me when I was at a real crossroads with some science. So yeah, all kinds of things that I could say about that journey.
Okay, well, thank you, Sharon. That's very helpful of you and good of you to share at such a personal level. So may I thank you again for what has been a great talk. And we've asked you some quite difficult questions, and we thank you for your very thoughtful answers. So thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.